Hello, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel and another scintillating 1812 with Josh and Jimmy video. Hi, Jimmy.
Hello.
Jimmy here is modeling his another one of his creations, this time sporting Nelson.
Yep.
I'm back with the Duke. And tonight, or today, or this evening, or this afternoon, we are talking about the death of the Grande Armee. It doesn't die quickly, but from this point, from Malaya-Slavets to the great river at Berezina, it dies.
And we're killing off the Grande Armee and we're chasing Napoleon out of Russia.
Hoorah!
So we left off last week where Napoleon has, by the skin of his teeth, escaped capture by the Cossacks at Malaya-Slavets, and actually, as a result of that, he decides he doesn't want to be captured by the Cossacks, so he's actually prepared a vial of poison. In case that sort of stuff happens to him again.
And actually, it's a conversation throughout the rest of the retreat with his closest officers, how to get him away if the worst should happen.
But first, let us go back to talk about the flanks, because we have not really addressed them much since before Borodino, really. Let's start with the southern flank. So Tomasov has basically held Renier and Schwarzenberg to a standstill for a couple of months, from July to September, and by September, Tomasov is basically waiting for reinforcements in the form of Admiral Chichagov's Army of the Danube, and Chichagov has maybe around 40,000 men with him. Somewhere along those lines.
I'm very tempted to nickname him the Amphibian at the second.
Right.
The Amphibious Admiral.
Yeah, Admiral. We've got Chichagov, a long way from the sea, which is his natural habitat, and he's joining Tomasov. Now, any sane, normal, competent army command may think that when you've got an admiral and a general who have united their armies, who's going to take command of the combined army? Well, in the Russian army, it's the admiral.
Obviously.
So Chichagov is basically at the head of this larger army, which is now sort of back to strength around 75,000 men. Meanwhile, Tomasov has been recalled to headquarters, and he's taking some reinforcements with him, as far as we're aware, maybe 10, 20,000 men. And Tomasov actually arrives at Russian headquarters before the Battle of Malaya-Slavets. So Tomasov is around when Malaya-Slavets happens. And by this point, you've got to mention that a few things have changed in the Russian headquarters. So obviously Bagration is no longer around. Unfortunately, we've lost him to his wound. A couple of Tuchkovs are no longer with us. So, and Bagavut has got himself killed at Tarantino. So there's a bit of a reorganization at Russian headquarters, And not only that, but our good friend Barclay de Tolly is at this point very ill. He was already ill after the Borodino, and he's not getting any better. And he basically requests leave from Kutuzov. It's granted, and he goes back on a very circuitous route back to his home in modern-day Estonia.
I believe he gets a deal of hate on the way back because he's blamed on the way back for the burning for the loss of Moscow.
Yes, when he's traveling in his carriage through the ancient city of Vladimir, apparently he gets pelted with stones, which is
unfortunate and can't have helped his condition a bit. But
quite so. But don't you worry, he's going to be back. Meanwhile, at Russian headquarters, we've got Kutuzov in command, and then really, even though the corps commanders who have been killed or injured or otherwise out of the way, even though they have been replaced, really it's not. You can't really talk about corps anymore, because in both armies the attrition rate is so high that really in every corps you have like 10,000 men at most. So now Kutuzov is basically amalgamating the corps into several units of maybe 25,000 strong, and he's going to use these columns to pursue the enemy. And having talked about the southern flank, we will briefly go to the northern flank with
General Wittgenstein, I think.
General Wittgenstein, indeed.
Who we last heard of being heralded in the song and
celebrated.
Yes,
by
St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg's literary elite. He's actually got a friend with him now. He's been reinforced with Stangel's Finnish corps, which is about 20,000 men. So altogether, Wittgenstein now has about 50,000 men under his command. And just a few days before Yaroslavets, from the 18th to 20th, the Russians managed to break through the French line on the northern flank by defeating Marshal Saint-Cyr's Bavarian Corps of about 30,000 men at the Second Battle of Polotsk. So now Wittgenstein is steaming along from the north. We've got Chichagov from the south, and then we're back to Kutuzov in the center, who is in charge of the main pursuit of what's left of the Grande Armee. And by this stage, we're looking at maybe 80,000, should we say?
To be generous, yeah.
To be generous, right, because certainly not all of these 80,000 are in fighting fit condition. And what's more, they've still got quite a long baggage train with them. They're still trying to get quite a lot of their loot out of Russia, all the stuff they looted from Moscow and other Russian cities.
I believe it's often said that there were many more troops walking along together rather than under discipline as it progresses from here. So I assume it must have begun, this disintegration of organization must have started by about now.
Yeah, by this point, the weather's getting colder. The Russians they're not hot behind their heels, but they're always on alert for Russians due to the fact that these flying detachments, small columns of maybe 3,000-4,000 Russian cavalrymen, mainly Cossacks, with some peasant militia also
mixed in. Dragoons, some line uhlans, and whoever wanted to go, really.
They were always operating behind Napoleon's rear, and now as Napoleon's retreating, these guys are continuing to harass the retreating troops. So bear in mind that this large body of men have not a lot of food left. They're out foraging. They've always got to be on the lookout for surprise attacks from these detachments. And just imagine,
every day almost. Whenever we're talking about gaps, this doesn't
right?
stop. And as we saw in the last episode, even Napoleon got jumped when he was seen to be just a small group of men in the distance by Cossacks just waiting somewhere.
Right. So this is happening constantly, and even if the Cossacks don't appear, there's always the fear that they are going to appear any moment. Just think of the anxiety that's going on. You're not sure where to get food from.
Firewood.
Every moment you're waiting just for Cossacks to suddenly appear, and you have to defend against that.
There are some excellent accounts of the poor French cavalry trying to keep the Cossacks off their backs. There's very dramatic scenes that he paints of them appearing and disappearing whenever they're faced with formed cavalry.
This is what the Cossacks are great at: very mobile warfare, and that's what the French are completely terrified of.
They're almost inhuman to the French, actually. The Cossacks, they are some sort of devils from the icy waste.
Certainly, from the French sources, they write of them as a sort of supernatural force. It sort of appears when you least expect them in two places at the same time, because there are many of these detachments operating about. And we should talk a bit about Kutuzov's strategy.
Yes.
What he's trying to do.
I've heard that there's two schools of thought. Some people say he's just trying to get Napoleon out, and some people say he is actually trying to destroy him, and some people aren't sure. Seems to change by the day.
Yeah. So I think my interpretation is that Kutuzov doesn't actually want to destroy Napoleon as such. I think he sees Napoleon eventually as a useful counterweight to Britain, for example. So I don't think, certainly the Tsar has other ideas, but I don't think Kutuzov really wants to completely defeat Napoleon. What he wants is basically for Napoleon to get out of Russia. I think that's what Kutuzov had in mind. So for most of the march, the pursuit, the Russians were keeping a fair distance away, the main body of Kutuzov's army, and he was mainly relying on these flying detachments to pick off isolated units and to essentially keep the French army on alert all the time, in order that Napoleon doesn't have any ideas to say, oh yeah, we could stay here and continue the campaign.
The second, his options are obviously would be to keep open the idea of fighting Napoleon, but as you said, he's not die hard set on catching him and fighting him. He at the second they're sort of heading back towards Smolensk. And Kutuzov would probably be have to consider ahead of time how to negotiate these strong points, because every strong point Napoleon reaches could be used as a defensive position.
By the 3rd of November, the French get to the town of Vyazma, and that's where the Grande Armee really begins to suffer from lopsided losses, where Kutuzov, again, he's not got most of his men doing the pursuit. He's got maybe 25,000 men under Miloradovich, who are keeping up the pressure on the center, and of those 25,000, maybe about 5,000 men under Platov, who's essentially the advance guard of the advance guard, who's trying to figure out what Napoleon is up to, where he is, what he's doing. And it's at Vyazma where Miloradovich attacks Davout's rearguard and just completely crushes it. Like they've got a similar number of men, but the casualties, as mentioned, are heavily lopsided. I think the Russians lose about 2,000 men, and the French lose 8 to 10,000. So
that's probably going to surprise quite a few people who think of Davout as this sort of quiet, godlike commander. But that, and especially against a guy who probably people don't take quite seriously, like Miloradovich. But
right.
that's a serious battering.
It's a serious battering. It's a serious dent on French morale, because to date they've actually not done too badly in set-piece battles, and Malorod-Yaroslavich, you could argue, was a French tactical victory. But by this point, they're now losing men faster than the Russians in battle, which has not really happened to date. And that's, and as you say, Davout, the Iron Marshal, he's usually one of the best defensive generals in all of history, arguably. Mm-hmm. But with the army he had with him then, it was difficult to mount much of a defense, given the condition of the men. And the problem was, not only did Vyazma really dampen French spirits, but it really annoyed Napoleon with Davout. And he claimed that Davout was moving too slowly to be the rearguard. And therefore, by the time that Napoleon got to Smolensk, he basically waited for Davout to catch up, and then he decided that Ney would become the rearguard commander.
Now, did he tell Ney this? Because there's a bit of acrimony in the French ranks about what happens next regarding this rearguard between Davout, Ney, and Napoleon.
They have a bit of a falling out, to put it, to put it charitably.
Did he actually officially name Ney the rearguard, or?
From what I understand, he did. Although, to be fair,
it's entirely possible he just sort of left him as the rear.
He just got frustrated with Davout, and just basically allowed Davout to go ahead. So maybe not. But in any case, we are now. So Napoleon arrives at Smolensk with about 70,000 men, of whom, at best, 2/3 of them are actually capable of fighting. And initially, he thought, "Oh, Smolensk. It's a fairly large settlement. Maybe we can spend winter here." Mm-hmm. And this was his whole plan before Malorod-Yaroslavich. It was his plan to go through Kaluga and to end up at Smolensk, where he was going to set up winter quarters. Unfortunately, Smolensk has been considerably damaged by the French during the earlier video, and also the French are not in a great condition to hold on now that the northern flank is collapsing, the southern flank is collapsing, and Napoleon does not want to be surrounded in Smolensk any more than Barclay did. Mm-hmm. And he has to get out, but he's lingered in Smolensk. He's spent 4 or 5 days lingering in Smolensk, and this allows Kutuzov to get the jump on him. And Kutuzov, Wily-Old Kutuzov, does so by taking a parallel route to the south, stopping at a place called Krasny. He arrives around mid-November 15th or so.
And this is obviously, of course, sort of what he did at Moscow as well, right, where he comes around to try and, if not physically block, to threaten Napoleon's future moves.
And to be fair, he had an easier job here, because he knew which way Napoleon was going.
Exactly.
Really. He was going back home. Mm-hmm. He was going west. Whereas in
Moscow.
With Moscow, yeah, Kutuzov thought that, well, there was some dispute as to which way Napoleon would go, but Kutuzov, being Kutuzov, did pick the right option, knowing that the French were heavily starved for resources. He's at Krasny, which is about 40 miles or so to the southwest of Smolensk. And essentially, by the time Napoleon's army appears, he's going to jump out and threaten at least Napoleon's flank. So, well, at least this is the plan. And on the 15th, he sends a flying detachment under Adam Ozherovsky, who takes Krasny and begins to establish the Russian position there. Unfortunately, Ozherovsky's men get themselves rather isolated, and Napoleon, making his way out of Smolensk, manages to see that Ozherovsky's position is very vulnerable, and he orders his Imperial Guard, who are now at the front of the column, because he wants to get his best troops out, and they manage to completely annihilate Ozherovsky's detachment.
Yeah, it's almost a surprise attack because Ozherovsky doesn't even really see it coming.
Right.
I believe the young guard just steamroll him out of the town.
The following days go slightly better for the Russians, shall we say?
Indeed, because Napoleon again has to pause a little. He tries to mobilize in Krasny and keep the road further south open while he waits for the rest of the army to get there.
So he's got Eugene's Fourth Corps, who's basically the first to come along after the Guard, and they're also in pretty decent shape. They fought well at Maloslavets, and they're still pretty far from full strength, but a viable fighting force. Unfortunately, while Eugene's making his way to Krasny, he is surprised by Miloradovich's vanguard, and virtually the entire corps is gone. So 8 to 10,000 men.
There are some very dramatic scenes fought in the snow around the town, as Eugene is pretty much pummeled by Russian artillery, and I think some squares are broken at some point, even by the Russian cavalry, and it's not good.
Right, because Miloradovich has basically got his guns overlooking the road.
Yeah, it's terrible.
The Napoleon and the Guard managed to get through earlier because the Russians were still establishing their position.
Yes, it was mostly just irregulars up at that point, and Davidov.
Yeah, therefore the Guard did manage to mostly get away, but now we've got the other units of the army. And bear in mind, he's still got Davout and Ney along the road. So
Ney hasn't even left Smolensk yet.
Yes, that is very true. So by the time we get to the 17th, so Kutuzov has a decision to make, because the Grande Armee is now rather strung out. So what does the Russian army do? Does it try to sort of fight it locally? Does it try to keep as one unit and concentrate its efforts on a particular section? So Kutuzov decides to divide his army into three. So you've got a column led by Tomasov on the left of about 20,000 men. In the middle, you've got Dmitry Golitsyn, who we've actually never met before, but he's a cavalry commander who was at Borodino, just arrived at Borodino, commanded the reserve cavalry, and he's a very competent, very distinguished general, and he's now at headquarters as one of the senior generals. And he's commanding the middle, 15,000 men. And then Miloradovich is now on the right. He's now kind of turned from vanguard to rearguard in a sense.
He's also probably got some of the toughest, freshest troops who didn't get battered at Borodino.
Yeah.
So he's got some of the best troops in the Russian army in his, I'll call it corps in the French sense.
Right, in his unit. So because he's basically occupying the same position he did when he defeated Eugene's corps, because it's pretty good.
It's a good position.
It's a good position to ambush the French. The 17th, again, you've got the French making their way. Tomasov and Golitsyn do a bit of pursuing. Miloradovich essentially does exactly the same to Devu as he did to Eugene the day before. And not only that, he manages to capture the Iron Marshal's baggage train, including his Marshal's baton, which is currently on display at the Museum of the Patriotic War of 1812 in Moscow in Red Square. Go there once the situation is better. See Devu's Marshal's baton and be amazed at the feat of Russian arms.
Indeed. Cheering erupts here.
Yeah. So Eugene down, Devu down. You got Ney.
Now, Napoleon is pretty much is again blaming Devu for being so slow. Yeah. He actually has the gall to blame him for leaving Ney behind in Smolensk and not going together.
Yeah.
But now Napoleon makes an interesting call, which is to leave Ney.
Yes, I think he's basically given him up for a lost cause. Because, I mean, frankly, you've got the entire Russian army between Ney and Napoleon. Napoleon's known to abandon people, so
and he has the road. He has his road open at the moment. But I think Davu's up there at the second with Eugene, and they're worried about it being cut off. Basically,
they want to get out as quickly as possible. So at this point, I think Napoleon's basically saying, "Rest in peace, Marshal Ney."
Yep.
We'll
remember you.
We'll remember you. We'll see you in the next life. I'm sure you'll get a nice tomb at the Invalides or something. So Ney, who leaves Smolensk late and basically finds himself with Miloradovich now no longer flanking the road, but on the road, blocking his way in front of him. He has a problem.
He's very angry to start with. He properly swears about Napoleon abandoning him.
Yep.
Pretty much, calling him many, many expletives and derogatory names.
Yeah, and
you can see his point.
Yep, no, he was very justified in doing so, one feels. So what does he do? Ney being Ney, he tries to fight his way through.
Mm-hmm. There is a bit of negotiation, I think. Miloradovich does offer him terms.
There is a bit of negotiation, but I think Ney, he wants to go down fighting.
Yeah.
And he doesn't go down, but most of his corps.
It's bad.
Yeah.
I think General, I don't know his rank at the time, Robert Wilson, saw it.
I think it was a general, yeah.
And he said that Ney managed to get through 2 of the 3 or 4 Russian lines before the artillery and Russian reserves just blasted him off the road.
Yeah. So yeah, he made a bit of progress. It was never going to happen.
No.
And Ney was just basically like, fine, we'll just have to, go another route. Which
so yeah, of course.
Which he manages to do.
Whilst... He has only about 2,000 men left from.
At this point,
I don't know how many men he had to start with, but
around 9,000, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's lost the bulk of his men.
It's already really bad.
He doesn't have many men left, but at least there are fewer of them. Therefore, they can move quickly.
Yeah. He goes to a circuitous route northwest, I think.
Northwest.
Northwest and west. Platov does get onto his tail at one point, but he manages to get away.
To run away. And by the time he reaches Napoleon, I believe at Orsha, he's got maybe 800 men with him. And Napoleon it's as though a zombie walked in, because he has no idea how Ney has managed to do this. And
the rest of the army is just as shocked.
Right.
Delighted but shocked, because they love Ney.
Right, they've given him up for dead, but he's managed to get through somehow, and I'm sure he's been regaling Napoleon with all the stories about how he managed to get through, the ruses he took in order to.
Yeah, he used some of his Polish officers as an example to speak Russian to the sentries to get out of the way, and keeping his fires burning in front of Miloradovich, and many tales of daring do.
Of trickery.
Yes.
And but no doubt also some rather colourful language. He's got the gang back together,
He's now the bravest of the brave.
Right. This is the episode where Napoleon names Ney the bravest of the brave, and I don't know whether he immediately names him Prince of the Muscova at this point, but I think it's around this time where because he's just so impressed at how Ney has managed to get through.
Even though it is in larger, looking at the larger picture, another terrible disaster. Like the Grande Armee has now lost about 2 limbs. If you're talking,
it's lost. It's basically the guard left. Like Napoleon has the guard left. That's obviously no horses, no infantry corps really, and a bunch of generals.
Yeah. Which he, I think, later on will basically form into a small bodyguard that his responsibility is solely to get him out if necessary.
I think they're all like general rank or higher or something.
Yeah, colonels and things like that.
It's just a bunch of senior officers. I think at this point we should talk about how many men the French lost, because they lost a whole bunch.
I don't even know how to. There's that famous graph.
Yes.
And it's now a really thin line.
Yep. So before the battle, or at Smolensk, Napoleon maybe had 70,000 men.
Get prepared for some shocking numbers here, all right, people.
In the financial world, we'll say that number has taken a significant haircut. It's a 50% fall in the men he has with him. So about 10k killed and about 25,000 captured. By this point, Napoleon is left with about 35,000 men, of whom not all of them are capable of.
As you said, pretty much the guard is the formed unit.
Yeah, the guard is the only viable fighting force he has with him. I think at this point we should talk about what could have been different about Krasny. Specifically, whether Kutuzov could have done anything different to make Napoleon's job a lot tougher.
From what I've seen, he made his job incredibly tough.
Yeah.
Pretty much maimed what was left of the French army at Krasny. It is argued, because Miloradovich hammered Ney by basically just blocking the road, that this should have happened. I think some Russian generals at the time were pressing Kutuzov to
get onto the road.
Finish Napoleon there.
Yeah.
And he didn't. He actually pulled back a little.
Yeah.
I think I've seen that it is argued that he thought that a lot of his troops being fairly, he lost a lot of good men at Borodino. And it's argued that a lot of the army was conscripts and not up to the fighting prowess of the French at this time. But
yeah. And I think that is a fair argument. So, notwithstanding the fact or the contention that Kutuzov probably didn't want Napoleon to be completely destroyed, that at this point, the Russian army or Kutuzov's men are not in the best of shape either. At Tarantino, they probably had 100,000 men with him. By this point, as a combination of desertions, of casualties, of detachments, and of also of the cold. Let's not forget that this winter is also taking a heavy toll on the Russian soldiers, and not all of them are surviving it. Even though the Russians are better equipped for the winter, that doesn't stop the winter from taking its toll. And by this stage, I think Kutuzov only has 50,000 men. So actually, his army has almost been cut in half from Tarantino. So we should keep this in mind when talking about the French retreat, because I think the common view is of the French suffering so badly, or the Grande Armee suffering so badly, which of course they did. But you've also got to find out that the Russians are not having a whale of a time
either.
It's not
party either, is it? And you look at maps and you see these blocks representing divisions and troops, and it looks good at Krasny. But yeah, I mean, the Russians have only just started to enjoy battlefield superiority over the French as well. So if they tangled with Napoleon at Krasny, they'd be dealing with Ney, Davout, Eugene, and the Guard.
Yeah.
And it's still decent odds they'd get beaten.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that the Russians had the strategic initiative and far higher morale. That's without doubt. But the army sizes were not that different. And when you come to the quality of the soldiers, then you could definitely make the case that even at this point, you could say that Napoleon had the better soldiers, the more capable soldiers. As you say, the Miloradovic's men is probably in the best of shape. That includes some of the Guard, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
But the rest of the Russian army are fairly raw recruits from Borodino and after. So I think Kutuzov is criticized for failing to completely arrest Napoleon's march and just sort of annihilating him. But I think he has a lot of justification for not going too hard.
Yeah, you don't want to push his luck at this stage.
Right. Especially because you've got reinforcements coming, or you've got two other columns, essentially armies in their own right, of Russians from the north and the south under Wittgenstein and Chichagov respectively. And they are now converging on Belarus, which is where they're going to cut off Napoleon's retreat. That's the plan at the river Berezina. So
can you tell us a little about the river Berezina, where it is and what sort of an obstacle it is? And why have we not run into it before? Did he cross it on the way in?
I think part of the army crossed it on the way in, but it's sort of, should we say, western. I think it's like western part of Belarus, of modern day Belarus, and it's a fairly wide river, and so usually in winter it shouldn't be too difficult for an army to cross, because the river would have been frozen and you could get men across the frozen ice. Unfortunately, I mean, this is the thing about the Russian winter, right? People talk about the Russian winter being so cold and everything. The moment that Napoleon wants it to be cold,
Yeah.
all of a sudden there's a thaw at the Berezina. And it's basically a raging torrent of water. There's no way in hell you get over without a bridge of some description. And there is a bridge at Berezina, and that's what Napoleon is heading towards. However, on the southern flank, you've got Chichagov. He now has a much smaller army, because he's basically detached half of it under General Fabian von der Ostersacken to essentially chase the remnants of Schwarzenberg and Renier, who have fallen back onto Warsaw. So at this point, we're saying that Chichagov has like 35,000 men. He's marching towards the Berezina, to the left bank of the Berezina. So to the side that Napoleon wants to get on.
Get to, yeah.
Right, yeah. So he's basically wanting to wait for the Grande Armee. He wants to get there first.
With open arms.
Right, exactly.
He's already taken Minsk.
Yeah, he's taken Minsk, which is very important because that was quite an important French supply depot. A lot of stuff that the Napoleon really wanted. Even worse, Chichagov has managed to cross the Berezina himself and take the town of Borisov, which is on the eastern bank, and which controls the only bridge across the river for miles. Like that, if you want to cross the Berezina, this is where you do it. We now turn back to Napoleon, and he's actually been reinforced by a couple of corps under Victor and Oudinot,
Okay.
who are coming down from the north, because by this point the northern flank has fallen. Wittgenstein, after defeating Saint-Cyr at Polotsk, he's now gone in further and defeated Victor and Oudinot at Smoliany. And by this point, Victor and Oudinot are going back to meet Napoleon, essentially as Napoleon is making his way to the Berezina. And bear in mind, these corps they've not been through the whole sort of to Moscow and back. So they are somewhat battered. They are in much better condition than what's left of Napoleon's main army. So now Oudinot is essentially designated the vanguard, and Victor is designated the rear guard. You've got these two fresh corps defending the front and back. So now we get to
what does he do? What's the plan? How does he get across the river now?
Yeah. So Napoleon is in a bit of a pickle, because Chichagov has obviously already taken Borisov. So Napoleon basically orders Oudinot to get Chichagov out of there. And to be fair to Oudinot, he manages to do so. He manages just to retake Borisov, but not without Chichagov being able to burn the only bridge across the river and cross to the left bank, where he is essentially now waiting. What do you do now? The only bridge has been destroyed. There's no crossing for miles either side. Is Napoleon's army finally going to find its grave at the Berezina?
Good question, and I think it must have crossed a lot of people's minds.
Yes.
Because it's just a very dire situation. But out of this, you get a little flash of brilliance, actually, from Napoleon, which has been missing.
It's been missing
since almost the beginning of the campaign.
You could possibly argue that since after Smolensk, Napoleon's brilliance has just declined precipitously.
Yeah.
But desperate times calls for desperate measures, and Napoleon comes up with a plan. So he gets Victor to build pontoon bridges across the Berezina south of Borisov. So he's giving Chichagov the impression that that is where he wants to make his crossing. At the same time, French scouts have discovered that there's actually a ford. I believe it's the Polish who discover that there's a ford 7-8 miles to the north of Borisov at a place called Studianki, which is where Napoleon is actually going to cross. So the idea is basically to distract Chichagov, to make him believe that the crossing is actually happening at south of Borisov, and then to get the men over as quickly as possible over the ford and pontoon bridges at Studianki.
And we know that Napoleon was a student of classical warfare, and Alexander the Great did something very similar to this on the attack at the Battle of Hydaspes, where he distracted the Indian army in front of him by marching his troops up and down as if he were preparing to cross one place, where sending a light but fast force to get around at a different ford.
Right. Yeah, this is what Napoleon is trying to do, and he's actually quite successful in doing so, because Napoleon arrives on the 25th at the Berezina, pretty much. And that's when construction work or Victor's construction work begins. And it's not only building bridges, it's also sort of trying to set up an artillery position and giving the impression that stuff is going on. Mm-hmm. And Chichagov believes that stuff is going on because he can see it going on. Meanwhile, on the 26th and 27th, the French build pontoon bridges at Studianki as quickly as possible.
Yes, it's the Dutch pioneers who are given 50 francs bonus to wade into the icy water to get these things across.
Yep. And most of them end up dead.
And under the eyes of the emperor who watches from the bank.
The Dutch sacrifice themselves in the freezing water, but they manage to get the bridges built, and Napoleon gets his men across, starting with the guard, and then with the most capable, effective men, because he doesn't have time to get stragglers over.
No. And he has an army of stragglers in themselves now,
Yes.
just massing around the riverbank.
Yeah. So by this point, he has maybe, with Victor and Oudinot's reinforcements, he has maybe 60, 70k now, but around half of them are not in great condition. And yeah, essentially now it's the guard and it's Oudinot and Victor. So yeah, on the 26th and 27th, Oudinot manages to cross. He's now occupying Studianki on the western bank, and the old guard are obviously already through. And then it's only by the 28th when Napoleon has managed to get a large chunk of his army across, when Chichago is basically like, oh, maybe they're not actually trying to cross it.
Should something have happened by now, do you think?
It's Chichagov who is the main Russian force, and he's caught napping, and he doesn't realize in time what the French have done. So by this time, Oudinot has crossed, and the guard has crossed, but the guard is continuing along the road. So on the 28th, Chichagov eventually decides, okay, maybe we should try attacking the French at Studianki. He does so, but is repelled. Once again, he's worsted by Oudinot. At this point, the rest of the French army try to make their way across, but by now, finally, Wittgenstein's men are mostly here, and Kutuzov's men, or at least the leading parts of them.
Miloradovic again, I assume.
Yeah, that's right. Are now on the scene, and this basically results in a massive crush towards the bridges. And we're on the morning of the 29th. One of the bridges collapses due to the weight, and at some point, Napoleon has to decide we need to get going. And at 9 o'clock in the morning, Marshal Victor, who's been commanding the rearguard, decides to burn the bridge and to essentially leave half the contingent on the other side of the Berezina.
By this point, it's no longer a case of Napoleon being incompetent or making mistakes. This is now actually pardonable exigencies, basically. He's in the hole, and the decisions he's making now are unavoidable for any commander in this apocalyptic situation, really.
Yeah, because once the leading units, the fitter units of the Grande Armee have crossed the river, there are still Chichagov's men on that side of the river. And okay, he's been worsted by Oudinot a couple of times, but they still need to worry about them. And and by now the Russians have turned up, and obviously the Russians could use the bridge to cross, which is why you've got to get rid of the bridge.
Yeah, they'll have a bridge themselves in a day.
Right. It doesn't take long to put a bridge up, but at least you're winning yourself an extra 20 hours or so to get a bit further down the road. The Battle of Berezina is kind of considered the moment when Napoleon manages to get his army out, even though even though you're not actually out, you're still in Russian territory. You're still within the territory of the Russian.
He hasn't got back across the Yemen yet, has he?
Exactly. And just to talk a bit about Berezina, because Chichagov has a lot of generations of historians have given Chichagov a lot of the blame for not performing well at the Berezina, and they have a point. You know,
Yes.
when you're basically sitting around for 2 days thinking that Victor is trying to make the crossing, and frankly, like when you're trying to make a crossing, you don't need 2 days as
No.
as Napoleon demonstrated on at Studianki. You need
Yeah.
like maybe even like 12 hours or so is enough to get a rudimentary pontoon bridge up. But Chichagov just seems to he seems to have been marching up and down a little, just not exactly sure what was going on. Not sure whether it was actually the crossing at Studianki, which was meant to be a feint. Once he's been distracted and he's moved his army all the way to Studianki, then Marshal Victor is going to get his bridges across. I mean, yeah, there's one of Chichagov, and there's like 2 places he has to watch. So you could.
It's not an easy thing to do, and he was legitimately duped.
Yeah.
You know, he took the bait, but he had to in a way because he does have to watch the bank.
Yeah.
So if you see French pontonniers building bridges, you do have to observe them. That his biggest error would seem to just be that he did not scout up and down the river for other
Right.
places,
Yeah.
which a competent commander might have deduced. If I'm here, Napoleon has to either hit me here, which he's unlikely to do, or he has to search for another one. And that's when the maps would probably come out, or the scouts and Cossacks would have to be sent up and down the riverbank. And that's probably where his biggest failing lies, because he seems to have been unaware of these other bridges.
Yes. Let's bear in mind, one reason for that is because he doesn't have much experience of commanding a land army. He is a damn admiral. He is at home on the seas, or indeed in St. Petersburg. But where he isn't at home is, commanding a large field army, where a more competent general, a general who has had some training in military colleges or in army colleges, will be aware that some staff work needs to go on, and it seems like either he was unaware or he just misinterpreted what it meant. Either way, I don't think Chichagov is actually 100% to blame, far from it, because he was only 1 prong out of 3, and you had Wittgenstein bearing down from the north, and then you had Kutuzov coming from the west. And this is actually still quite a big if Kutuzov actually wanted to completely surround and annihilate Napoleon's army, then both Wittgenstein and Kutuzov could have gone quicker. And this is anathema to like Russian sort of scholars and historians. I mean, more recently it's better, but Kutuzov is holier than thou, and therefore you cannot criticize him for doing anything wrong. But I think at the Berezina, more so than at Krasny, I think at the Berezina, Kutuzov bear a fair amount of the blame for not closing up quickly enough. Essentially,
Napoleon was sitting around there for much too long, unthreatened, really.
Which leads you to the conclusion that maybe Kutuzov, and I think this was Kutuzov's personal opinion. I don't think. Well, let's put it this way. I don't think most of the Russian generals or indeed soldiers would have wanted to continue the campaign outside Russia.
Yeah.
But I think Kutuzov was really the only one, or one of few, who actually thought that we can't kill off Napoleon completely due to the wider geostrategic implications of doing so. And I think that's because only Kutuzov was the sort of person who could think in that way.
Yeah, because that's another thing about Kutuzov is up till now he has made excellent strategic judgment calls. Whenever he's been called on to make a judgment on a strategic issue, whether it's where to move out of Moscow, how to tackle Smolensk, the position at Smolensk, he's made the right decision.
Oh, yeah.
So that is why I would agree that he's deliberately really not pressing the issue here.
Yeah, his basic, and to be fair, like after Berezina, even though there's still like about some distance to go until you get to the Niemen, until you get out of the Russian Empire. By then, it's pretty much all done. And Napoleon has no thoughts of taking the offensive, and the campaign is pretty much over. And again, Kutuzov does not want to risk more of his troops than he wants. So I think on balance, I think if Kutuzov wanted to encircle and annihilate Napoleon, he probably could have done. But I think I don't know.
Seem to be other issues at play,
Yeah.
and as to whether it was a mistake or not, it's difficult really to call.
Who can go into Kutuzov's mind?
Exactly, because it's a labyrinthine Byzantine place.
Far smarter than any of us.
Yes, and I think the only way you can probably say outright that it was a mistake is if you look at the next 2 years.
A lot of death and destruction.
Yes, which could have been ended there. And I think that's probably where it comes into criticism. But as a decision, it was an intelligent decision, even though it's vague, because we don't actually know what he was thinking, and nobody else did either.
But so just to conclude, we're past the Berezina, and a few days after the Berezina, on the 5th of December, I believe, is when Napoleon gets on a sleigh and gets out of Russia as quickly as possible, because I think he thinks that the army is safe enough because the Russians don't actually pursue too heavily after Berezina. So Napoleon thinks the army is safe. He's off home, back to Paris, because actually it's already been a month when he's heard the news that there's been an attempted coup against him, led by General Malet, who is Malet basically.
They think he's dead, don't they, or something like that? They say that he's dead.
Right. They basically issue a proclamation or announcement saying that Napoleon has died in Russia, so we're going to take power. That does not go well for Malet. In fact, his coup is suppressed very quickly within the space of days. By the time Napoleon hears about it, Malet is already dead. Napoleon still wants to get back to Paris as quickly as possible because he realizes that you've had one coup attempt due to the general feeling that maybe your power is not so your control is right, and therefore Napoleon needs to re-establish control, re-establish authority back home. So he legs it, and I think gets back blistering place. It's like 12 days.
Yeah,
that's really impressive for that time.
And I mean, we can say as well, people do criticize Napoleon a great deal for abandoning the army. He has more reason to abandon the army here than he did in Egypt, is what I'll say about it.
Yes, in the sense that he did need to go back to rebuild an army.
Yeah.
Having completely completely annihilated. And
we got 3 pretty much armies annihilated, to be honest, by numbers, pretty much.
Yeah. And,
the amount of men he lost in Russia through organization and casualties, speaking, when you talk of an army, you're talking of an organization. He lost the equivalent of 3 practically in under a year.
In about 6 months.
Yeah. So
yeah, his desire was to go back to Paris to rebuild, to recruit a new army, to take the fight back to the Russians and whoever is going to join the Russians. He believes that actually the Prussians and Austrians are going to hold Russians back because they are relatively fresh troops, which is
just wishful thinking, really, isn't it? If you think about it,
it's wishful thinking, right? Because okay, on the one hand, they are technically some of your freshest troops. On the other hand, they've not been fighting very hard for you when you've got like 50,000, 500,000 men. Are they really going to be fighting for you when you're in such dire straits?
And the answer is no.
I think not.
Within the year.
So Napoleon legs it, and he leaves Murat in charge, which may not have been the best decision he made in his career. The thing is, you could argue morale is low. Who can increase morale? Murat, by prancing about, by
being Murat,
by being Murat, by generally trying his best, he could try to raise French morale, but he's not very good at organizing and keeping order
He's not the steadiest guy.
Especially when the army is in pieces and essentially, and this is the thing. So about 20, 25, 30,000 men get across the Berezina. The stragglers, some of the stragglers do make their way over from other units and stuff. So while you do hear, from an army of 600,000, Napoleon only ended up with 20,000 left when he crossed the Berezina. Maybe it adds up to about 50,000 by the end of it, which is still not.
Oh yes, it's no way good, but yeah.
But it's slightly better than the sort of more dramatic figures.
Yeah. And the long and short of it is that Murat doesn't stick around very long,
because he realizes that in his home kingdom of Naples, there may be some order to keep and some authority to reestablish. So he legs it to Naples, leaving Eugene in command of the rest of the men, 30, 40,000 men, whatever. And Eugene doesn't do a bad job, actually. He manages to get them a relatively safe, and at this point, they're still being pursued, although not very hard. And they just want essentially a new defensive line. They want some friendly faces.
Yeah.
So they're making their way a long way across Central Europe to find larger numbers of. And I think that is where we conclude the Patriotic War of 1812 on the 26th of December, when Tsar Alexander issues his manifesto, which basically says, we have driven the last French soldier out of Russian soil. I promised that I would not sheath my sword until I did so. In fact, he doesn't. But he's now declared this campaign over.
In the most theatrical way. As if it was a stage performance, we now draw the curtain.
Yeah.
I declare this campaign closed.
It's actually quite interesting, because Alexander by now is in Vilnius. And at Vilnius, having been there at the start of the campaign, it goes full circle. And at Vilnius, it's where
interesting symmetry.
The authorities at Vilnius have to turn things around very quickly. They basically, having waved a tearful farewell to the remnants of Napoleon's Grande Armee, they then welcome the conquering Tsar. Even though he didn't do much conquering himself, he's just coming to enjoy all the glory.
Yeah.
And this is where we get a massive spectacle, songs and stage play, musical opera type sort of thing. So this is where the victory against Napoleon is celebrated. And
it provides a full stop for anybody talking about it or writing about it, because obviously things aren't as neat as they are when they're retold. Things go on. But for the purposes of this is the logical end point, isn't it?
Of the 1812 campaign, yeah. We've taken viewers through a roller coaster of fortunes and emotions.
We have indeed.
as Boney takes his massive army of 500,000 men all the way to Moscow, where he's already lost most of them, and then
All the way back.
all the way back and has lost most of the rest of them.
It is therefore with some regret, ladies and gentlemen, that we have reached the end of the 1812 saga.
And indeed, we probably have.
We're not quite done either.
Yeah, because we have some bonus episodes when we talk about where the Russian generals ended up after 1812, and other topics such as what to go and see about 1812 if you're actually in Russia, and not necessarily battlefields, but museums in the larger cities of Moscow and Petersburg. There's a massive amount on 1812.
And with that, stay tuned for more bonus content on the 1812 subject, and we'll see you next time.